It was a typical neighborhood party where people gathered in pre-organized groups. One group talked soccer, another group garden. Soccer mom sat in the living room and DIY enthusiasts sat in the dining room. Since I work shift, I arrived a little after midnight and had a lot of catching up to do. Luckily, I lived in the neighborhood, so I didn't have to worry about drinking and driving. I was making myself a drink in the kitchen when Lee walked in to get more ice. Lee was the hostess, and I'd had a warm relationship with her since the day she and her husband Brad moved here. She knew of my interest, but we both realized it was never meant to be, and our relationship had turned into a good-natured semi-sexual, mutually beneficial relationship. Lee was 3 months pregnant and had that healthy, sexy blush that women have, and to me, she had never looked sexier. I can't get over it, baby. 3 months pregnant and still the sexiest woman in town. You look good enough to be eaten. Lee brightened as she looked at me. Thank you, kind sir. All compliments are gratefully received. The doorbell rang, snapping me out of a restless sleep. I glanced at the bedside clock and wondered who could have gotten me out of bed at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. I grabbed my robe and walked to the door. I looked out the peephole and saw Lee standing there. I opened the door, invited her in, and only then did I notice how strangely she was dressed, high heels and a raincoat. But when I looked out, I saw nothing but bright sunlight. Lee turned to me and said, "Did you really mean it last night when you said that despite being pregnant, I'm the sexiest woman in town?" I stared at her in some confusion. Why is she asking me a question like that? Coming to my senses, I said, "Absolutely. All you have to do is give me a chance, and I'll prove it." Now any other time I would have said something like that. She would have just laughed and called me a big flirt, but this time she surprised the hell out of me. She unzipped her cloak, let it fall to the floor and appeared naked in front of me. "Would you be able to prove it by taking me?" Good God! I wished I could someday. I picked her up in my arms and carried her to my bedroom where we spent the next 3 hours doing our best to pleasure each other. She was a tigress in bed, and every time I felt like I'd given everything I had, she managed to get me back on my feet again. We only stopped when it was time for Brad to come home after his golf game. The story Lee told me was that as soon as they were found out she was pregnant, Brad stopped having sex with her, even though the doctor told them it would be okay for the rest of the pregnancy. Brad wouldn't touch her for fear of harming the baby. She was used to having sex daily and had been climbing the wall since Brad left her, but no matter how much she begged and pleaded, he wouldn't sleep with her. The next morning, Lee showed up at my front door just as Brad was getting ready for work. We headed straight to my bedroom, but before we started anything, I had to satisfy my curiosity. "Did Brad hit on you last night?" She smiled. "Yes. He did. In fact, he did it 10 minutes after he got home from his golf game." For the next few months, Lee and I fucked every chance we got. Monday through Friday, she was at my house as soon as Brad left for work. On Saturdays, she would call me if she needed to leave the house to go somewhere, and I would meet her. On Sunday, Brad would play golf and Lee and I would work on our own holes. Eventually, however, Lee went too far and we had to stop. She finally decided to give birth to a little girl, and I began counting the days until the doctor would allow her to resume sex. But a cruel disappointment awaited me. A few weeks after the baby was born, Lee came to my house for a cup of coffee. She thanked me for being her friend and for being there for her in her time of need. She told me that if I ever needed anything, to just let her know. I told her that what I needed most was for her to get permission from her doctor so we could resume our sex life. Lee looked at me strangely and said, "We can't start over. Once the doctor says it's okay, Brad will take care of my needs." And so it was. Soon, she and Brad went back to their daily routine, and I was left with a longing that could not be quenched. I stopped going to neighborhood parties where I might see her and generally did everything I could to avoid her. One morning she knocked on my door and invited me to have coffee with her. She bluntly asked me why I was acting like a stranger. I snickered and guffawed before I couldn't stand it and told her the truth. I just couldn't be around her after what we had together, knowing it would never happen again. I thought we were friends. She said, no Lee, we were much more than friends, and that's something I can't forget. The next 6 months flew by. I had a few girlfriends, but none of them could hold my attention for long. Sometimes I'd see Lee in her backyard and feel unbearably homesick. Then one morning, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw Lee standing there. I moved aside to let her in, and as I turned to close the door, just in time, see her dress fall to the floor. Naked, wearing only high-heeled shoes, she smiled at me. Guess who my lover is? I'm pregnant.